On this episode of the Data Trek, I have Mike Dahl. He is the head of data and analytics at Udacity. He has a very interesting career. We'll talk about his journey, how he pivoted into the industry, and as well as some of the challenges he's seeing at Udacity. Previously, he's spent time at LendingTree and Upwork in a variety of management roles. Hey, Mike, thanks for being on.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I know I alluded to a non-traditional path. I know a lot of our listeners ask about how do you make a pivot into the industry and some of the challenges of what has to be done. With your background, I thought it'd be an interesting starting point to kind of talk about your transition from a degree in math through marketing and then obviously making it a journey into the technical side.
Yeah, so happy to talk about the path that kind of led me to Udacity, and then talk a little later about what I'm doing here and the challenges we're facing and overcoming. But certainly my path to a data and analytics leadership role has been a little different than most. And I can say that, there's more than one path, having hired a lot of analysts and data folks at this point. And so mine began coming out of school where I worked in financial trading, then spent a couple of years in strategy and management consulting. And while those may both seem a little bit unrelated into the roles where I've ended up, I actually picked up quite a few highly relevant skills early in my career in those roles. A lot of strong Excel work, even some coding in VBA, working a lot with data visualization and trends and putting those data signals into action. Getting comfortable with risk in the trading world is actually, I think, an underrated skill when it comes to then being a business analyst, being comfortable with the fact that we don't have all the information, but we have to make the decision anyways. Consulting added a lot of data cleansing, business modeling, and just great exposure across business. And what I've found since moving into data and analytics is if I were to break down a lot of people's paths into two kind of primary buckets, I found there's people who come straight from hard data skills and are trying to get more into the business leadership side of things. And I followed the other path, which was bringing a lot of business skills and picking up more of the quantitative and hard data skills once I moved into analytics. So coming out of consulting, I moved into marketing at LendingTree, where again, I picked up some relevant skills working with A/B testing, working with data tracking. I was very deliberate about connecting with people across the digital marketing teams and in our headquarters across product management, our BI team, a lot of the technology and engineers. It was something that sort of came naturally to me, being just kind of curious to go learn about those functions. But it really also paid off when eventually at LendingTree, I transitioned into the analytics team. And I think that was an opportunity that was open to me internally that it might not have been there externally. And able to leverage my business acumen and my familiarity with LendingTree's business and our goals and our data, and apply them more directly in the analytics space in supporting the other business functions. Even as then I quickly began to work with a lot of people who had a higher degree of technical skills, whether it was SQL and database management, coding, modeling, data science prediction. I've picked up a lot of that over the years, but continue to find that I have a lot of respect for the folks who have those skills first and foremost. And now in my role as a data and analytics leader, I'm often finding, that I'm coaching and mentoring people to learn what I picked up in the early days, applying those skills more directly to the business and, finding ways to not just generate data, but generate recommendations, plans of action, and really make an impact on the business.
So when you mentioned the two paths, you either come into the industry with the technology background or you have the business acumen. Ideally, to move forward, you need to come out to be a well-rounded resource in the data analytics space. For you particularly, when it came to picking up the technical skill set, how did you approach going to solve that? Is it just naturally in your job they asked you to do it? Did you have to go train on your own? What was the actual, uptake to pick up the hard skills?
It was a combination of some deliberate training and a lot of on the job picking it up and a lot of humility, being willing to like actually go to people who I was their boss and I would be asking them to help me solve a technical challenge or learn something new in SQL and not, being scared of that moment and that encounter with someone, admitting that they had stronger skills than me and I was willing to learn. So I did a lot of that on the job. Things like data science, I was fortunate enough to go do like a couple day seminar training on machine learning modeling, and that really was highly valuable. And since moving to Udacity, like I'm trying to take advantage of our own nano degree programs that are really geared towards teaching technical skills. And so there's a little bit of that taking advantage. But one of the choices that I faced as I was given leadership opportunities at Lending Tree was sort of whether to more deliberately choose to focus on those technical skills that you mentioned, or begin to add a third skill set, which is sort of leadership and management. And I chose the latter and actually did more specific, like reading books, attending some continuing education courses, seeking out training on the leadership and management component, and sort of accepting that I would never be as technically strong as some of the people I would hire, but that was no longer my role.
Interesting. Do you think, I guess looking back at it, I know you have a math degree, so obviously not some of the fundamental CS components. Did that help? Like, I'm just curious because I know some people graduate with a variety of different degrees in the industry and everyone has different paths, but did the actual math help or was that just, not a factor for you?
I would say it certainly helped, and not necessarily more so, but I took a computer science course as an elective. I took some data theory, like computability courses. And what I think it really added up to as a technical skill set was just sort of problem solving and critical thinking. And actually, when I'm hiring analysts, I generally list that as the number one thing that I want to try to discover in the candidate is whether they have those skills, because you can learn to code SQL, you can be taught Python, you can, pick up a lot of these just tangible elements. But if you're not curious, if you're not structured in your thought process, if you're not able to take a business problem and break it down and figure out how to take many small disconnected pieces and put them together, which is sort of the fundamental skill set when I was studying math at University of Chicago. It's all theory based. So you're just doing proofs. You're just trying to take a little bit of knowledge that you have from here, there, and everywhere and piece it together in an unfamiliar way and come up with a solution. And I think that particular skill set has probably been the number one thing that I took away from that experience.
Interesting. Yeah, so I guess that's just a follow up to that. So a lot of hiring managers, when they're looking at the analytics space, it's becoming more of a hybrid analytics slash engineer. I guess an analytics engineer. I've seen that title sometimes. Is the trend from what you're seeing in terms of hiring moving a little bit towards having those hard skills as an analytics person, or do you see it as the problem solving skill still is really where that is the value add to somebody coming into the industry?
I think a certain level of quantitative skills is a bit sort of a table stakes. It's a given at this point that you have to be strong with SQL. You probably have some modeling or scripting skills, and or you are familiar with data architecture and so on, writing ETLs. We certainly encounter a lot of that. And I would say even just over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of emerging programs, masters of business analytics, masters of statistics and analytics, and a lot of candidates who have clearly really made that deliberate effort that you referenced earlier to add their own technical skills. And so I think to a certain degree, it's become, like I said, almost a given. And so I said earlier that I was fortunate to make the transition myself at Lending Tree. I'm not sure that someone else would have hired me because I didn't have those skills. And so, it speaks to the power of seizing opportunities that are in front of you along your career path, because you never know what opportunities are out there or what you may or may miss out on. But going to your question about like where the industry's heading, I'm not sure that I'm necessarily representative. I think that there is some other companies and other data teams. I've spoken with other leaders or attended conferences where people are building teams slightly differently. Certainly larger organizations have more of that, just dedicated technical skill set, and you're tackling those problems a little bit more isolated or more removed, let's say, from the business. But the type of program that I'm trying to build at Udacity that I lived at Lending Tree and Upwork and then trying to recreate here is much more plugged in and embedded with the business. And so it's not enough to just have that technical skill set. You have to be comfortable engaging with the business stakeholders directly and translating their requests into a real analytics framework and getting kind of behind the question. I tell my analysts all the time, don't just take a request at face value if you don't understand exactly what they're trying to get at and why the question is valuable, that they should engage in that dialogue and be willing to push back and get at the root of the problem. And then ultimately, when you produce an output, whether it's a deck or a dashboard or some piece of analysis, that it should be more than just handing off numbers. It should be providing real depth and recommendations and a path towards action for the business. And our stakeholders really appreciate that. And I think they're really looking for that. So I guess, certainly for any organization that's similar to the one I'm trying to build, and we're certainly not alone, the technical skill set becomes sort of a given, and you have to learn how to think like your business stakeholders and merge that with your data skills.
Awesome. To kind of wrap up this topic, if you had a piece of advice for someone who's starting out, wants to go into data analytics, that may be doing immersion program or one of the new, like 1-year master's degrees, is something that looking back, you're like, man, if somebody would have told me this coming into it, it would have helped me a lot.
For myself personally, it would have been some of those hard skills that I mentioned because I had to pick them up on the fly. And I look back and think, wow, if I'd known this, like been stronger in SQL or in Python, 6-7 years ago, I could have solved a lot of those problems that I ended up solving, but I would have solved them faster and more efficiently. But I think, speaking maybe to the people who are instead coming up through these programs, if you're coming through a boot camp or a master's program, or you're getting trained really in those hard skills, or you're taking a Udacity nano degree, then, my advice would be to really lean into curiosity and opportunity, that don't limit yourself to just that data world. I think what served me really well has been going out and building connections and understanding, sort of a mutual understanding with your business partners. And you do that proactively so that later, when a real business challenge emerges, you have that sort of common language to go reconnect with somebody, whether it's in your data engineering group, in the sort of front end web dev engineers, whether it's your product managers, your marketing managers, your sales team. If you understand more of how they think, you can be much more effective analyst when that kind of project arises.
I think that's pretty awesome insight. I know we wanted to kind of transition to talking about what you're doing at Udacity. I know you're a little bit over 6 months joining the organization, and obviously you're joining with the pandemic hitting not too long after you start, and you definitely have some interesting challenges ahead. So I guess in terms of what you're doing now and some of the challenges you're facing, I guess managing new delivery features and then also maintaining what's already there. Maybe we can dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question. So let me start with just a little high level summary of what my role is and what Udacity does and kind of how I came into the role. So, Udacity, for those who aren't familiar, we are a online education platform. Our mission is to train the world's workforce. We have ambitious targets for trying to get to scale up our organization so that we feel like we can really make an impact on the skills gap that we've kind of been talking about. That there's people are trying to pick up these technical skills, but as far as the industry is concerned, there aren't enough of us who speak data or coding or AI. And Udacity is trying to help fill that gap. And it's really applicable in the current time frame. You mentioned COVID. Udacity's business we're facing uncertainty and new challenges just like everybody else, but we're also doing, I think, certainly better than average. And that's because the nature of our product is kind of attuned to these times where we're able to offer something that is really valuable to people who face uncertainty about the future of their careers and to companies who are trying to use this moment to pivot and align themselves for the future that requires a lot larger degree of technical skills, and also being comfortable working and educating remotely, as I'm sitting in my home and you're sitting in yours, and people around the world are having to learn this new dynamic of remote work. That's going to open up possibilities around the world for people who are in underprivileged situations, and Udacity feels like we're in a position to help set them up for success. So that's kind of quick intro on Udacity. I came in late last year and took over the centralized data team here that includes our data engineering, data science, and just general business analytics efforts. And previously, that group of people had been decentralized and dispersed for a little while. And our new CEO, who joined a few months before I did, we have a shared history at LendingTree, and he wanted to sort of recreate that central analytics function and up level the value that was coming out of that organization. And so that kind of created the role and the opportunity. And yeah, the biggest challenge in the first half year has been just organizing the group as sort of a newly formed central data team and setting up the kind of pillars that will put us on the path towards efficiency and success in the years to come, while at the same time having to meet a fairly insatiable demand from the business for data. I tell people that I'm recruiting for my team that some people are coming out of organizations where the data team fights for the impact of their business, or rather the impact of their analysis, to like turn their analysis into action. Here, our challenge is to keep up with the pace. And that's a really exciting challenge to have for a data professional. And it's a much better challenge. And so it makes the work dynamic and exciting. And I'm really kind of been enjoying the first 6 months and trying to, like I said, set us up for that long-term success while at the same time managing our business.
And I guess just to dive in deep on one aspect there. So when you did start, and obviously you're seeing the transition, you guys are, in an interesting space, taking advantage of online education. It's exploding. It's great timing for you to be there as well. Like, how was that understanding of how the requirements are changing or the new features that are being asked of you? Like, was that something that you were part of on a daily basis? Were those decisions being made, just outside of you? And, you were realizing that just because of this pace of the change? I was just kind of curious about that.
It's a mix of both, but actually, majority of the time we have been plugged in. In fact, almost to too much of a degree, to a little bit. It was like in my first week on the job, somebody pulled me into a meeting and was like, "Tell us what to do about this." And I was like, "Well, I'll do my best, but it's my first week, so I can't exactly claim to be data driven yet when I haven't really wrapped my head around the data." But it shows, the nature of the culture that we're building and that already have to a certain extent that wants to have the data team be a partner in the decision process, whether that's in the early going around formulating strategy and making kind of directional decisions about how we're going to build or test the product, or after the fact when we've taken action and we want to judge whether it was successful or not. The data team is generally involved, and so the challenge, as I said, was partly keeping up with it. I inherited a group of analysts that are all fantastically skilled, and a lot of them have been with Udacity for a few years and really understand it. And so I tried to leverage their experience and their skill sets while figuring out how to deploy us in a way that would keep up with those demands of the business. And that involved a little bit of reorganizing the team to be slightly deployed differently against the way that Udacity is operating. It also involved just working and coaching with them to kind of leverage some of those business-facing skills that I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. I was curious. So you'd been in the office a few months. Obviously, go remote, getting comfortable. And I know sometimes you have to push back. There's obviously requirements that you need to let somebody know that you might not be able to deliver, or expectations need to be set. How long until you're comfortable with that? Because obviously you're now remote. Some of the team building, some of the comfortability factor of being integrated in teams kind of goes away since obviously you didn't have that extended in office FaceTime. Like, did that impact you at all, or were you able to operate and push back as needed just because, I mean, obviously you've been in management for a while as well?
Yeah, I guess I would start by saying I'm highly grateful that I had the 3 months that I did to connect face to face. And one of the specific actions that I took coming in was to host a global offsite where we brought our team in from, we have folks stationed in India and the Middle East, and got everybody together and, was able to lean into a little bit of that relationship building, trust building, as well as just actual functional meetings. And so that was really valuable. And I look back and I'm very grateful that I had that opportunity before we were sort of cut off. And I also made it a point, coming into my role, to cast a really wide net early. And I looked kind of at my job in the first month or two was to go connect with as many people as I could. And that was even outside of knowing that we might be working remotely. It's kind of my viewpoint that as the department lead coming in, I'm only as effective as the sort of strength of my relationships around the rest of the business. And so I made a point of connecting with every person that I possibly could. And so, in that sense, I was able to build some relationships and establish some dialogues and trust with folks ahead of time. But even in those early days, I would say, you mentioned pushing back, and I sort of took a mindset that I was going to be sort of unapologetic about what I thought was the right decision for the data team to do the things that would set us up for success, like establishing new processes, hosting that offsite, focusing on building the things that were really important, like our data engineering team is sort of reconstructing our underlying core source of truth data tables. And that means really leaning into that and maybe doing a little less of the ad hoc stuff. Similarly, for each of our business functions, our analysts face choices every day between requests that come in for data on XYZ, any number of questions, and empowering them to say, no, I'm focusing on this really deeper analysis or building this new sort of company-wide dashboard and putting the effort into those things. I tried to set up processes to empower that. Like we have a new Jira process that centralizes a lot of the requests. But I guess, as you said, when it comes to the core question of like being comfortable pushing back, I guess I developed that comfort a while ago. As you said, I've had a chance to be in a leadership position for a number of years, and that's just the nature of the data team. Being a central data team is you get requests from anywhere and everywhere all the time, and everyone has the impression that their request is the most important request. And so it's incumbent upon you to, in a professional way, push back and help be fair and consistent in a process that allows us to prioritize the right things.
Exactly. You mentioned prioritization of requirements. I know you made the analogy of managing the new features and delivering on the old is similar to changing an engine while the car is still on. How did you, I guess, again, coming up to speed, you had a couple of months FaceTime, you're off now, working at home. How are you keeping track of the value? Obviously, I know you guys have a product backlog, things are a little disconnected, but how are you actually keeping track of how to deliver value between those two new and old feature sets that you were alluding to?
Yeah, I think it starts with the mindset that I mentioned a moment ago of being sort of unapologetically determined to make room for the long term and being transparent in that mindset with, I report up through our head of engineering, so our chief technology officer organization. And I obviously have a connection, as I said earlier, with our CEO. So, being willing to be direct with them about what's most important for the team and what that means for the sort of throughput that we can otherwise do in the short term. And so I felt like being upfront, honest, and direct on setting those expectations would sort of buy me, and it has bought me some of the patience and the room to operate. So being proactive rather than reactive, because otherwise it just would result in a lot of difficult conversations if people like feel like we're making decisions without any process. But that mindset is sort of step one. Then I also took a structured approach to, as I said, going out and casting a wide net on connecting with people. But that wasn't only to connect with them, personally and build a relationship. It was also to listen to them and ask what challenges they're facing, what would they really like to be doing, and then just synthesizing all of that input into a roadmap for the team. And that process was kind of happening throughout Q1 of this year, collaborating with my data team as well, and ultimately generating a set of initiatives and some core targets around like centralizing our data, building the processes and structures that would allow us to be a center of excellence for the organization so that we can scale and enable other people without having to hire 1,000 analysts, building out the core set of data visibility that allows the rest of the business to operate on sort of an automated reporting fashion, and recognizing those opportunities across each business line. We operate in the consumer space and enterprise space, government space. We have our services organization that supports our students. We have our content organization that actually builds our nanodegree educational content. And each of those functional areas of Udacity have unique needs, and trying to recognize like what are the most critical things long term that would make them more successful, and then putting that down on a roadmap. Because then it comes back to, in the same vein of setting expectations transparently, then also setting up a transparent roadmap that says this is what we're trying to build. I find our stakeholders are much more understanding of, if you're going to tell them no, no, I can't do that, and tell them instead what you are doing that will add value and why. And that makes a much more productive dialogue. So then that was kind of the process. And you asked, how are we tracking that? One thing I've done, just sort of acknowledging that there's sort of a perspective and a viewpoint on the data team that is just broadly external to us. And also at the same time, liking to have quantitative data. I've just established a survey process where on a regular basis, we're reaching out to the entire company pretty much and asking them for input and quantifying it and tracking our progress, and watching the numbers go up and to the right is a good way to sort of get that feedback that what we're doing is making an impact and making that sort of long-term progress. So that's been one. And then the others is we have an OKR process where we're, really putting a stake in the ground around some of the things that we want to accomplish each quarter, and then holding ourselves accountable to it, evaluating our progress at the end of the quarter, and making sure that we are really accomplishing those long-term goals and not letting the day-to-day whirlwind of the business sort of overwhelm us.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I guess the one, other perspective for, you're establishing the surveys and you're evaluating it. And the flip side is, you have a finite amount of resources that you're managing. Obviously, you have a team that's distributed, balancing who's working on something new versus maintaining something old. And also, obviously, a lot of people enjoy working on new features, and kind of the balance, I think, is kind of potentially key in keeping a team happy. Like, how do you go about making sure that side of the house, balancing the team's demands, are met?
I think it just becomes ultimately an ongoing management challenge. And it's a reason that I've been trying to be thoughtful, is one of the other elements that I hadn't mentioned yet, is just around how the team's organized and then what our hiring plan is, so that we have sufficient support across the team. Each analyst and each data scientist feels like they have sort of managerial coaching and guidance. And it's important then to maintain that balance that you mentioned, because the way we're organized is there isn't necessarily a split where this analyst does all the old stuff and this analyst is working for the future. Because as you said, that's going to discourage a lot of people, especially in a smaller organization like ourselves, where we have less than 20 people on the team. There's not like a whole pod of junior analysts that we can just go throw at the less exciting tasks. Instead, we're organized by business area. We have people who are focused on supporting our consumer business, focused on supporting our student services, and so on. So they have to kind of operate on their own balance of, meeting the incoming requests while being held accountable to their OKRs on those long-term things. And then it becomes a challenge to them for their own career growth to demonstrate good judgment and keep to the process. I mentioned earlier in the conversation that we implemented a JIRA process, and That's valuable to me in my role to be able to centrally see what's going on across the team. It's also valuable to each individual analyst to have a place where they can talk to their stakeholders and have discussions around, as you said, it's finite resources. If you want your new request, your new dashboard, whatever you, to be prioritized and accomplished this week, then what are we agreeing that will not be done this week that was otherwise going to be prioritized? And so having a place to have those discussions is, it leans into that transparency that I think is really important for being a centralized team. That if we're going to have our own priorities and our own roadmap, then we have to invite the business stakeholders into that conversation and allow them to have input as well.
I guess from the team's perspective, it sounds like Agile is an integral part of the process as well. When it comes to interacting with stakeholders, like what's the process of making those decisions? Like, are they empowered to make the decision? Is it, hey, let's talk about those decisions and then prioritize? I guess, how are those, decisions handled within the individuals of the team, bubbling up to you potentially?
It does vary a little bit by the seniority of the analyst. Like one of those long-term things that I mentioned earlier, like I came in and built up a career matrix for my team so that they can reference like where are they at in their level and how do they get to the next level. And I think that sets us up for long-term success because it helps everybody currently on the team and who joins to kind of like feel comfortable and have clarity and then have a path. And I mentioned that because then the expectations around like managing priorities and stakeholders is actually like explicitly spelled out in that matrix.
Hmm.
And so if you're a more junior analyst, you probably do have your manager involved most of the time. And if you're much more senior, then I absolutely want to empower the analysts to be making their own decisions. And in fact, that's the expectation that is set, that you should be exercising good enough judgment to have earned your senior status. And then it becomes sort of like an inverted dialogue with your manager where you're saying, these are the decisions that I've made, just letting you know. And there's an opportunity to then to perhaps if there's a disagreement then, but it's more of asking for forgiveness than permission and sort of making that switch as you grow in your career. And I think giving the analysts that opportunity, we started off the conversation with, kind of thinking about people who are wanting to get into the space and grow. Exercising judgment is definitely a skill, and that is more highly valued the higher you go. And so you have to develop it. And giving the analysts the opportunity to do it is one of the ways that they kind of maintain that interest. They feel like they have a growth opportunity.
Very true. I guess just a side question, because I know you mentioned you're reporting to the CTO at Udacity. I guess at Lending Tree, were you similarly reporting to the CTO, or is it different structure?
Between Lending Tree, Upwork, and Udacity now, I've either reported to the chief financial officer or the chief technology officer. And I think either one of them works. I think those are the best places. Or alternatively, if your company has a chief operating officer, that's fine. I like the optics of not being part of an actual functional department where it just feels to some stakeholders like if you're part of the product organization, that are you truly unbiased when it comes to dealing with marketing and sales? So I appreciate that, being in those more neutral departments. And then amongst them, I think for each organization, it really depends on who's going to be your best sponsor and who's perhaps got the best sort of experience and mindset towards actually understanding the nature of data and analytics and helping your department to a certain degree, but then also being a strong voice at the table. Obviously, nowadays some larger organizations are developing chief data officers or chief information officers, and then data itself gets a seat at the C-suite table, which I think is probably the right decision for most organizations if you're large enough. But in the meantime, it's a great place to be is with the engineering org, and we have a good executive sponsorship.
That's interesting. I know that different reporting structures, different relationships. I think you did a good job of kind of summarizing some of the pros and cons there. I guess just a final question. I'm starting to like to ask this because kind of gives me insight. And also, I think it's just interesting from what responses we get. I know you've been a mentor before, but if you were to right now have a mentor and you could ask anything of that mentor. Is there anything that particular that you're looking to learn, or something that you or somebody could help you with?
In a way, I still do sort of have a mentor. Actually, my direct manager at Lending Tree on our analytics team, he and I developed a strong relationship, and that was really, I think, a critical part of my growth, to have that sponsorship, the trust to go take on new opportunities, and coaching to help move me along. And so, to those who are listening, one thing I would say is, don't undervalue the opportunity to work with good people, because it'll take you further than title or maybe a little bit of extra compensation. Having that sponsorship was really important to me, and I've seen it be important to others. And like I said, I still have that connection. And so I guess I do reach out sometimes. And the primary area where I'm still enjoy getting feedback and support is just around making some of those, the comfort making some of those decisions that we've talked about. When you come in as the head of data and you're being determined to do the long-term things and having to push back and have a strong point of view around what's the right decision, it's good to sometimes have a little bit of second opinion, or someone who will validate your decisions, or perhaps run an idea past. And so those are the moments where I do occasionally reach out, or if I don't, I wish that I had someone to walk into their office and talk to them about it. Is just discussing the choices that you have to make, and having that sounding board is important because it's not always clear what the right decision is. And like I said up front, that trading made me comfortable with risk. And so I continue to have to take risks to this day and live with the choices, and hopefully learn from them as well.
Awesome, man. I think that's fantastic advice. I appreciate you spending the time and being on. If somebody would like to reach out with a follow-up question, what's the best way to reach out to you?
My LinkedIn, you'll find me, Mike Dahl, Doll, on LinkedIn. I'm pretty responsive to connection requests and messages. And so happy to always make new connections in the business or analytics world, and pay it forward a bit. Like I said, I've had great sponsorship and opportunities. And so if I can do that for some people and pay it forward, I'm happy to.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thanks for being on. And everyone out there listening, I appreciate you giving us any feedback on this podcast. Reach out to Mike with any questions, any follow-ups. Please leave a review for us on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on, and hopefully we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.